Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the show, Science Dispatch Podcast. So good to be with you, as always. My name is Cameron English. I'm your host, joined again by Dr. Chuck Dinerstein, Director of Medicine, the American Council on Science and Health. Chuck, it's been a minute. Literally, how are you?
I'm still fine. Thanks for asking.
I'm glad to hear that. I'm always happy when my friends and colleagues are in...
And I have learned over time that when you're asked about how you're doing, that is a snapshot at the moment, because things can go to hell very quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, on that happy note, let's talk about a miserable subject, and that is scientific fraud. So this is a story by Susan Goldhaber. She's who I fondly refer to as our resident toxicologist here at ACSH. And article is called "The Lasting Impacts of Scientific Fraud." And Susan writes up here at the top, "Far too many scientific papers are being retracted from prestigious scientific journals because scientists fabricate or falsify data. Although no one defends scientific fraud, few recognize its long-lasting impacts on governmental policy and society." Indeed, Chuck. So tell us what's going on here. How big of a problem is this?
I think it's a problem that's big and getting bigger over time. First, I would separate the sciences just a bit. It's very tough to have a replication crisis in physics or in chemistry. They're pretty amenable to quantitation. When we talk a lot about the replication problems, they are either in the areas of human behavior, which is anything goes there, or in the area of the complex systems that are formed from the basics of chemistry or physics, especially the biological sciences. There's a lot of factors in there, and sometimes, we don't really often account for the unknown unknowns, and that can change the results of biological experiments in a lot of ways. So that's part of the problem with reproducibility. We shouldn't necessarily have the same standards there, though we shouldn't have to have the same certainty that we might apply to a finding in a physics or a chemistry journal when we apply it to a biologic. We have to apply a few more grains of salt, I think, for more complex phenomena. In any case, Susan really wanted to talk about two particular cases of fraud or mayhem, and they're in the long shadow they cast. And of course, the classic one is the Andrew Wakeman study on autism and measles vaccination. And she spent some time discussing that, and obviously that particular study has been quoted for many years, even at the point when they decided that the science was not good. They didn't retract the article. They didn't retract that article for 12 years from its publication. And during that time, it got a lot of play, was cited in places, and continues to have its own life with the anti-vax movement today. So that was one example she gave. The other example that she mentioned is a little less well known. It didn't even make it into the Oppenheimer movie, which is where it has its origins, and it really talks about the effect of specifically radiation on a biological organism like ourselves. And the theory, there are two theories about low dose radiation. There's no doubt that at high doses radiation is bad for you. At low doses, it's a little bit less clear. And one school of thought has always argued that at some point the risks of the radiation are lost. It doesn't have any terrible effects because our ability to repair radiologic injuries to our chromosomes, to our genes, is very good. And that once the levels get below the levels of our ability to correct it, they don't seem to be a problem. Some people even argue that, a little spritz of radiation now and then is beneficial. And there are some interesting studies that exist where they look at people that have had pneumonia and a very profound inflammatory response in their lungs where they're not able to oxygenate at all. And if you radiate these individuals and downregulate the inflammatory response as a result of the radiation, they seem to get better. But the position that has become the standard for judging all risks is the no threshold model, saying that even a little bit of radiation is bad for you, so that even a little bit of whatever particular toxin it is for the day is of concern, which goes against the general concept that the dose makes the poison.
So again, all sorts of fascinating edges to this. Maybe we can start with a more macro look. Everyone's talked about Wakefield for decades now, about what a fraud it was, and it was, and how the Lancet actually defended him for years and tried to help him evade the investigation you were talking about, which is a journalist named Brian Deere, who published a series of essays in the British Medical Journal. So we can talk about that for a second. But one thing that always struck me about this as an outsider, is a writer covering scientific topics, is that everybody in the sciences will openly acknowledge that there is a replication crisis, particularly in some of the softer, in quote, sciences like psychology and biology and so forth. But when you take aim at a specific paper, specific study, or a specific field, you tend to get a wagon circling effect. So if you go in climate science, for example, if you were to say, there is some, not necessarily crisis, but there is a lot of literature in this field that is dubious, maybe not deliberately, but a lot of it's modeling based, and it's pretty widely recognized that a lot of it is not reliable. You can find interesting research looking at that. But if you were to take a specific criticism and point it at, say, Michael Mann at Penn State University regarding the hockey stick, there was the recent controversy over that. Everybody goes, "How dare you!" Their best Greta Thunberg impression, right? So and again, I'm not trying to adjudicate any of these specific cases. But my point is if you try to say maybe there's an instance of fraud here or some sort of academic misconduct, everybody goes, "Hey, that's my team. This is my turf, and we don't like it when you accuse." So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think there's a problem with assigning intentionality, and that's what gets people completely crazy. And I've written, again, I'm old, so I've written it before. Only the shadow knows what's in the hearts of man. And so a legitimate criticism of a piece of science or an article or a model gets lost in the human behavior to assign some intent to this. I mean, there's cases of outright fraud where people take a picture and use it to describe something that never took place. Okay, that's pretty clear. There are other times when people do sloppy work. God only knows. We've all had our moments of doing that. So to ascribe that as to some kind of conspiracy, when we should really ascribe to just being a lack of discipline and a need to get something published or any of a number of other things that don't have that same intentionality, I think that's part of parcel of why we have these fights. I mean, you don't have to look any farther than COVID and all the fighting back and forth about COVID, one way or another, on either side of the aisle, that it all gets down to the other people are evil and we're the only ones that are going to save us. And you could choose whichever side of you want. That's the position that's there. I think that what Susan was getting at was a little bigger issue. Let me see if I can just pull this up real quick here. Let me.
Yeah, take your time and look for it. No, really, it's okay because there's so many things that are relevant here. I mean, it has impacts on the public understanding of science. It has impacts on our long-term understanding of all these issues that we like to look into. So if the body of literature that you have grows over time, but a lot of it is garbage, you're running in place, or you're going backwards. So,
okay, I'm going to give you 2 quotes from a book called Animaxter. I'm sure I just brutalized that name. Written by Carlo Rovello, who is a physicist, but he writes so well. He understands physics and writing better than I. So I had a shot at the writing, but the physics I didn't. In any case, he's talking about science, and he makes 2 points. Science, I believe, is a passionate search for always newer ways to conceive the world. Its strength lies not in the certainty it reaches, but in a radical awareness of the vastness of our ignorance. This awareness allows us to keep questioning our knowledge and thus to continue learning. Therefore, the scientific quest for knowledge is not nourished by certainty, it is nourished by a radical lack of certainty. Its way is fluid, capable of continuous evolution, has immense strength, and a subtle magic. And then he compares it with this other one. Anti-scientism feeds on the disillusionment over science's inability to deliver definitive visions of the world, on the fear of accepting ignorance. False certainties are preferred to a lack of certainty. And I think that really captures, to a large extent, some of the reasoning behind why Wakefield continues to live on, why there is a reluctance by regulatory agencies to reconsider how they view harm, both the topics that Susan brought up. And I think that one line I think really captures it best. False certainties are preferred to a lack of certainty.
Well, the final thing we can talk about here, and I think this is probably an extension of what you're saying, is that there's a kind of an inertia involved here, where it seems to me, at least, again, as mostly an outsider, I have one peer-reviewed publication to my name, and it's probably the only one I'll ever have. All the incentives are against fixing this. So, everyone will say it's a problem, but the academic journals make money by publishing articles, right? So they have their incentive is to publish as many as they can, and again, that's part of the problem. Is sometimes peer review is either lacking or non-existent in these studies. Researchers thrive on their grants, so their incentive is to get grant money and publish as much as they can. And I think the institutions that fund that research, so the NIH or the National Science Foundation or the FDA or whomever, and again, that probably extends to some private actors as well. They want to fund research and get it published. They don't want to go, hey, sorry, we spent $3 million on this study that turned out to be a complete and utter fabrication. Our bad, right? We'll try better with your money next time, So talk about that. The incentives seem to be working against a solution to this.
The incentives are not designed to generate science, air quotes, all capitalized. Though I'm going to, you have to ask yourself whether there's any funding mechanism that simply wants to discover knowledge for the sake of discovering knowledge. That doesn't seem to be in the cards. Hasn't been in the cards for a long time. So I think you're correct. I don't know that private research is any better. They have their own perverse incentives. They're incentivized to develop products for sale and to demonstrate at the margin that the products are better, and then they can get out there. So I don't see any big advantage to screaming about the funding of this study over that study. I don't know that they're being funded by a private enterprise versus the NIH, which is a government enterprise, is any different. So I think that it gets down to once again, how we as a society ultimately think about science. And I think that because of the way we teach science in school, most people think of science as kind of this dead concept with a bunch of facts, because what else can you test for except knowledge of facts? And it's important to have that basic knowledge so that you can question it, because science is not definite. It's just the best explanation that we have at the moment. And I think that gets lost somewhere in school. And then I think the other thing that comes up, this is my hobby horse to ride, is that we think that that science is somehow that anybody can do science. We don't recognize that science is a fairly disciplined methodology. Abraham Flexner back in 1910 released the Flexner Report on medical schools in the United States and changed and improved the quality of medical education. But that model was a German model based on what German scientists were doing under Bismarck in 1870. And in 1870, you could be a physician scientist. You could, take a blood sample and go look at it under the microscope. But you can't do that nowadays. But we still insist that our physicians be trained as physician scientists, even though none of them, or a teeny fraction of them, will go on to actually do science rather than clinical medicine. And I think we see this same kind of belief that you can do science and your other thing at the same time replicated elsewhere. And that's not being fair to science, because we don't understand that it's a methodology, it's a lifestyle, not a set of numbers in a graph.
Yeah, that's a really good point. From talking to you and some other clinicians, I think that's just comical. The idea that you're going to see any number of patients that's going to make a difference and, publish a study that's going to make an impact is it's adorable.
And here's the perverse incentive. So what they do is that very often in the middle of the residency training, you'll take a year off to work in the lab, which is perversely incentive to the residents because it means not having to take as much call. And it's perversely incentive to the academic guys doing science because it means there's a bunch of free talent that can come in and clean beakers and write papers. So, but how the number of them that actually go on to do science as part of their daily medical practice is nil. And I have the fortune of knowing several people that are academic scientists that do research, and it's a whole different thing than what was offered to me. I'm happy being a clinician.
Yeah.
I like to report that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's where you get to see the impact is when you go, oh, you're sick, do this, or take this, or don't do this. And then they get better. You go, hey, I made a difference. That's great. Yeah.
I'm an applied scientist.
Yeah, it's excellent. Incidentally, my favorite example from the private sector of this is when, you see some idiotic study and it's like eating chocolate, reduces your risk of Alzheimer's by 13%, funded by the Mars company. Almost always. Same thing with blueberries, at your Blueberry Council joke, or the Coffee Association, or right?
Yes, you can tell from the article, it's not nuts, it's walnuts make a difference.
That's right.
Or it's not even a potato, it's the Idaho potato. That's your first clue.
Eating 4 ounces of Idaho TM potatoes once a day. Yeah. So all that to say, there's a lot of blame to go around. There's no simple solution. And there you go, everyone. Have a lovely week with that knowledge that a good chunk of what you read about science is probably not true. But I guess the lesson is, as always, is just be skeptical, right? If you read a headline, go look at the paper before you, yeah.
Yes. Look at, the phrase I use is read the plaque. I got that from 99% Invisible, which is a podcast on design. And they made the point that if you read the plaques that are affixed to the buildings, it will give you a lot more information about what's going on around you. And as somebody that writes about science, you have to read the plaque. You have to go back and read the primary source, because otherwise you're just not going to get the real story.
Yeah. To dip your toes in, look at a paper, read the discussion section, or as I fondly refer to as the come to Jesus section. Because if the researchers are even remotely honest, that's the part of the paper where they will say in plain language, here's what we did or didn't do, and here's what you can derive from our results and not derive. So it's a good start, and then work your way up to the methods section once you feel a little more comfortable with that. But there you go. Little life advice for you science nerds out there. So we're going to call it a day. Thank you for joining us as always. Follow us on Twitter, X, whatever it's called, at ACSH.org. I am at CamJEnglish. If you want to get a hold of Chuck, you can email the organization, because Chuck is the smart one and doesn't spend time on social media. And he'll interact with you, ask questions, comments, suggestions for the show. We love hearing them, mostly. And with that, we'll see you next time. Thank you.